when we get in these situations, there may be storms in our life, or we may get in these times of crisis, God is there. I think he was living on that same idea that God wants us to live on today, that Jesus can be there in no matter what storm of life that we are going through. God was with him in that moment, and he got a word of encouragement in the midst of that ferocious storm. And he's saying, look, it's going to be okay. But what we have to realize that in the midst of that situation, when wisdom comes back our way, we can embrace it and we can latch onto it. We're going to talk tonight about, we're going to actually read a story that's in the book of Acts. And it's something that it's a story I really like, and it's about the Apostle Paul. Many of you may be familiar with him. But to set it up, I want to just kind of say, how many times have those of us who are in the healing or recovery process, I mean, we may or may not, maybe we've had somebody in our life that has really kind of said, you know what, you really shouldn't do that. And it may not have actually been used or whatever it is we're struggling with at the time, but somebody was saying, that's probably not a really good idea for you, and we maybe didn't listen to them. I've been there. Has anybody ever done that? And so then we get in the middle of things, and there can become that I told you so moment that we hate so much, but we realize at that point we're already in a mess. And so what do? And part of the problem is, and that's one of the things we're going to get to in this teaching that you're going to like about this story, is we have our mind made up what we're going to do, and we're always looking for somebody to kind of, we kind of go through this whole group of people, and we get to this point to where I know what they're going to say, and I know what they're going to say, and so we kind of find this group of people that we find that we want them to say what we want to hear, or maybe we just don't want to hear it anyway, and we just go on and do it. And so then maybe there's that moment where we even try to, if we're a Jesus follower or whatever, and I hear this all the time, but maybe we reach this point and we see there's this great sign that I got this or I got that, or I saw the fog rising or the sun came out. And as soon as I saw this moment and I was praying for this breakup that I could get together with this person, and all of a sudden there was this shooting star, and it was just confirmation that it was a God thing. And so then we go down this path and we realize later on that it wasn't a God thing after all. And so we get all these false ideas many times that we associate with things that may have been a God thing, and they really weren't a God thing at all. And many times that boils down to the fact that we're not paying attention to the wisdom of others, or just good common sense, or we're too young to even know what wisdom is, and we won't listen to people who have time and experience behind them, and we head down all these different wrong roads and paths. And so what I want us to see is that many times it pays us to pay attention to what other people may be saying to us, and also that when we get in these situations, there may be storms in our life, or we may get in these times of crisis, that God is there, and he wants to meet us at that point, maybe even if we're in the middle of this whole tragedy or crisis situation. And so to do that, we're going to read, and we're going to pick up in chapter 27 of Acts, and we're going to read this story about Paul. And Paul, if you don't know anything about him, I mean, this is just so interesting. It's so interesting. It hit me today, and everybody probably knew this, but, when Paul, he was like one of the big religious people of all times, and you know that he was actually going around and getting permission to go arrest Christians and have them put in jail, and in many cases have them put to death, and he was there when Stephen was killed, and he approved of that killing. And so then he had this really experience on that road to Damascus we've heard about, where God really became real to him, and I think it even said that he began the next day going proclaiming the name of Jesus. And so there was this radical transformation in the life of Paul, to where what he had been so against, that now he had heard the truth, and he began to go proclaim the truth of the very thing that he was against. And so what's interesting is that in this story, he had been before one of the kings, who was Agrippa, and he had been before several people because he was being put in prison, and he was now going to go to prison for his faith in Jesus. Now, isn't that kind of ironic that the very thing he was against, the thing he was doing, now he was having to walk that same path, and he was being sent to Rome because he had appealed to Caesar that I really just have to build my case. And you really need to understand what's going on. And they said, they even got to the end of this discussion with Agrippa, and in chapter 26 of verse 32, it said, Agrippa said to Festus, he could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. So they had kind of even believed his story. And so he was going to become a prisoner of the faith, which, like I said, was one of the very things that he had been proclaiming himself. And so here we're going to pick up. And so he was on his way to Rome to go to Caesar, and we're going to read this whole story. And so I don't want you to get bored because you really have to hear this whole story. I mean, this is a story. And the writer goes through, and it's very interesting. There's a lot of good things in here, so just follow along as we go through this. It's chapter 27 in the book of Acts, and it says, when the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was in Adramyttium, on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. So, get the picture. They're getting on a ship, and it's giving us the whole route they're going to take here. And so the next day when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul, and he let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his needs. Now, see, that's an interesting detail just in itself. I mean, he was a prisoner, but it's important that we realize that he had some credibility with his captor, with the centurion Julius. He had some credibility, and they actually let him go to shore so that some of the people that Paul knew, who apparently were following along this whole story, and they knew what was going on, so they were there, and Julius said, okay, you can go on to shore there and visit with friends, and they can kind of provide you what you need. So see, that would be very unusual, wouldn't you say, for a prisoner. So we've established that Paul must have some credibility there with what's going on. And so it says, putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus, between the island and the mainland. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. So they were making a transfer, and they were trying to find this way to get Paul on over to the Romans. And we had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. So they didn't want to stay there. They wanted to go on. And so Paul, it's important to understand here, and one of the things I want to tie together with this is if you remember when Jesus was on earth and he was with the disciples, there were two significant storms that were written about in the Gospels, and Jesus was there in both of the storms. And in one of the accounts, Jesus had sent the disciples ahead, and they got into a storm, and then he came to them. And another one, he was in the boat with them, and a storm came. And so the point is that Jesus was there with them in the storm. And so see, Paul here, he's got all these different things going on, but Jesus had already gave the whole idea that in a storm I will be there. And there's that whole thing, where Jesus came walking on the water up to disciples, and they were scared to death, and all they had to do was let him into the boat. And I found that interesting when I was thinking about this, because I was thinking the whole idea of God with us in storms. And you know, in that situation, if you think about like all the famous storms that we've heard about and the ferocious storms we've seen, and there's this window in storms that, you know, it just kind of shuts down, and they say there's nothing else that anybody can do as far as emergency crews, and we're shutting off the ambulances and all the emergency crews, and for the next whatever period of time it is until this storm is over, we can't get to anybody because the storm is too ferocious, right? But see, one of the teaching points from that of Jesus, I mean, whether you believe that he walked on the water literally or not, the thing is that instantly, in the middle of the storm, he was there. He didn't have that waiting period until the storm was over. At the moment he was needed, he is able to be there in the midst of the storm. And see, I think that Paul had learned that lesson, and he had understood this because, see, he had spent all that time with the apostles and learning all these things. And so I think he was living on that same idea that God wants us to live on today, that Jesus can be there in no matter what storm of life that we are going through. And so they had made the decision against Paul's advice. We're not taking your advice, we're moving on. And then here we go, verse 13. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it, so they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. Now see, there's one of our teaching points. They had sound advice. You shouldn't do this. There's going to be loss of life. There's going to be shipwreck, and we really shouldn't take this on. And they decided we need to go for it because they basically said, we don't like where we're at right now. Now, they were referring to the particular port they were in. They didn't want to stay an extended period of time, but I believe the teaching point was they didn't like where they were right then, and they wanted to move on. They had made their mind up. And so when they saw that light wind blowing, that's where we would interject that they thought it's a God thing, right? They had the gentle wind blowing, and so they're moving on. And so it says here, but the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called the nor'easter, see, we've heard of those, nor'easter burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up, and they let it run before the gale. I mean, it was a bad storm. And remember, Paul's still here, and he knew this whole thing was coming, and he had warned against it, and he had what he believed that word was from God, and they had went ahead. And then the sailors, we sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. You can look at all the detail they're giving us of the strength of this storm. When the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it, they were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast, so they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale-force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. It was getting really bad. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. I'm not sure we can really grasp in that picture. Just for several days, you couldn't see the sun, the stars, or anything, and all the ferocious storm, and that would have to wear this entire crew down. It says in verse 21, no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, here we go. This is what we hear often. Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. Isn't that what we hear oftentimes? You should have listened to me. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God, and it will be just as he said. But we will be shipwrecked on an island. And so see, Here, even though he said, I told you so, he still thought and believed that God was with him in that moment, and he got a word of encouragement in the midst of that ferocious storm. And he's saying, look, it's going to be okay. And we're going to see that now they begin to listen to him. And he's trying to encourage them in the midst of the storm. And so, see, here's another point that we can look at. Maybe somewhere along the way we have avoided somebody's sound advice to us, and we find ourselves in the midst of this shipwreck problem that we're in, or this big storm that's going on in our life. But in the midst of that, maybe this same person or another person of great wisdom is coming to us and saying, look, this is going to be okay. And part of the issue with that is when somebody says that, it doesn't feel like it's going to be okay, right? Because it's still storming all around us. But remember, who got them into this mess? They did. Who got us into the mess that we are in? We did. But what we have to realize that in the midst of that situation, when wisdom comes back our way, we can embrace it and we can latch onto it and say, maybe, even though this person was right and I didn't listen to him, I don't have to live in a sea of fear and guilt, that I can now begin to realize maybe there is something to this whole God thing. Maybe this person that has walked all these years with God, that I don't have the same experiences they do, maybe what they're saying can help me find some kind of hope in the midst of this situation. And so then he goes on. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, 2 weeks, think about that, 14 nights, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed that land was near. And you know, many times, just think about that, 14 nights. Many times we self-destruct in a crisis that happens in our life in one day. Paul had been in the midst of this for 14 days. He knew it was coming. You know, there's another point. Many times maybe we can see a storm coming. And in Paul's case, it had nothing to do with him. You know, somebody else's misdeeds was causing him to be in this storm. This had nothing to do with him. But see, there's a total difference there because he was handling it differently. He knew who his hope was. He knew it wasn't his fault. He knew it had nothing to do with him. But yet he was holding on. And for 14 days, he had been going through this. And so yet he still was holding true to who his anchor really was. They sensed that land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. And at this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and they prayed for daylight. Suddenly they're praying. Now see, isn't that what we do too? We don't take advice, we don't listen, and then suddenly we pray. Now, that's good. I think that's great. But the lesson, as we're seeing here, is God is everywhere from the beginning to the end. And we all have different places that we're at in this story. So then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes of the lifeboat and let it drift away. Now, isn't that interesting? They have come full circle to, we're going ahead. A wind was blowing, it was confirmation, and we're setting out to sea. We're not paying attention to what you said, Paul. And now all of a sudden they're saying, cut the ropes. Listen to him. Isn't it interesting how wisdom comes around? I think it's encouraging to us that we can see that, and then we can hold on to the wisdom of others that may have walked paths different or similarly or different than what we have walked through, and they can give us advice in those situations. So they were now beginning to listen to him. Just as the day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. It's almost like now all of a sudden he's giving orders, right? And he's a prisoner. But see, somehow the wisdom of God seems to be able to rise. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes when all things fail, that we can really maybe say, maybe that is the wisdom of God. Maybe you're right about that. Maybe I really do need to listen to you now instead of trying to do it my way. And so he spoke up, and it said that he urged everyone to eat. He said, "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." So see, there's another important point. I mean, he felt like that, remember, 14 days ago, before this storm ever started, he had confirmation that there was going to be shipwreck, but he also had confirmation that there was going to be no loss of life. And so 14 days into this storm, he's still saying nobody's going to get hurt. Now, I would challenge us to think at times that if we heard the word shipwreck and then we also heard no lives are going to be lost, based on where you and I are at in our life, whether it's in our spiritual life or just whatever you want to talk about it, which word would we more or less latch onto? Shipwreck. Oh my goodness, shipwreck. But see, he held on to the entire picture. A storm is coming. In his case, there's going to be casualty, but nobody is going to get hurt. He was prepared for it and where he was at in his walk with God, and he was able to sustain that in his walk in life. But everybody else was freaking out. Remember, they were throwing things overboard. They had been so torn up that they weren't even eating. And so what's interesting is, that whole idea that Jesus talked about, I'll bring you peace. You'll have my peace. You'll have my joy. I mean, it sounds like Paul has some kind of a peace or a peace beyond understanding or something there that these other guys didn't have. So see, there is a difference when we have the godly peace instead of the peace of the world. And you can't really explain those kind of things. But Paul had hold of that, and now he was having opportunity in his situation as a prisoner to bring comforting words to these people. And so he said, "Please eat something now, for not a hair of your heads will perish." Then he took some bread, he gave thanks to God before them all, and he broke off a piece and he ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. And so, the writer of this book is Luke. And so we know that from him saying that Luke, the writer of this is a firsthand account. He's saying all 276 of us. So he was on this ship. And so I don't know that if he was writing during this time, I can't imagine, but he knew what was going on. This is a true story that he wrote down and passed down to us. This is something that we can bank on is true. All 276 of us who were on board were encouraged and began to eat. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. Now, when morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed down toward shore. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast while the stern was repeatedly smashed by force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held onto the planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. Now, isn't that interesting that they thought for a moment there, let's kill all the prisoners to make sure they don't escape, and then there had to be like that, wait a minute, Paul's a prisoner, we can't do that. He's the one that gave him that encouraging word. And so see, somehow in the midst of that, God's whole idea was able in his plan to be worked out through Paul, and everything that he had said to them worked out. And so then that was the end of that whole story. And so looking through that, what do we take away from that? I mean, that there is so much in there. I mean, are we at a point, and these are things that you could talk about in your small group. I mean, we talk about freedom points and we talk about walking it out. And I mean, the truth is that God is with us in no matter what stage of life we're in. He's with us before there is a storm, after there's a storm, in the middle of the storm. Remember the Jesus thing? I mean, he was there instantly. And one of the points of that teaching with Jesus, where it said that he walked on the water and he went to them and made the comment that he was there immediately. It also said after that it was just immediately that they were at the shore. And so he not only meets us in these crises of life, but he also carries us the rest of the way through those crises of life. And see, I believe the truth is that he's there all along. He's just waiting on us to acknowledge. I mean, part of the thing whenever he came to them, he waited until they asked him to get in the boat. And so see, I think from Paul's perspective, I think that's a clear truth that Jesus taught. I mean, he knew that he had the power of God, Jesus, whatever, right there with him in the boat. He knew that. And so when we go through storms of life, do we know where God is? Or are we waiting until it gets so bad and then we say, well, I need to pray? Or are we paying attention to ungodly wisdom? Are we looking for false signs? And see, that's where I would talk about, we talk about in this kind of ministry that we need accountability partners and we need sponsors and we need people who can speak truth in their life and we can share our struggles, but we can always say, I'm getting ready to go down this road, or I'm getting ready, as in this case, to put this boat out to sea, and is this really a good idea? And like Paul was saying, that is not a good idea at all. There's going to be tragedy happen. And so when we have those type people in our life, and who are those people that you would identify? Are we paying attention to them, or are we like the crew that was just waiting for the wind to blow and we're like, oh, there's the sign, now I'm going that direction? And see, I think there is so much danger in that. And I think many times that we call things God things when they're not God things. Like, I needed this exact thing, and all of a sudden it came along. And I made a comment earlier to some folks that many times in the history of celebrating freedom, I mean, we may have had somebody come in and just right off the bat, they said, I'm here and I've been in recovery for X amount of years and I've been through it all and I really want to be a leader. And we would be in the middle of this season where we may be praying for a leader. And we made mistakes many times when we would say, it's a God thing. God has sent us a leader. Very similar to where the wind started to blow. And so they took sail and they didn't follow sound advice. But see, we've learned from those mistakes that when, the enemy, I mean, he will send deception that looks almost like the truth. And so we've learned over time that we say, come alongside of us, work with us, just come and follow us in a group and work beside another leader. And we learn if this person, if it really was sent as a message from God or if it was a distraction. And so that's part of our growing up experience in being Christians, is to learn to call on the advice and wisdom of those that we know is godly, sound wisdom, and to not pay attention to things that can be deception, to learn to run them through that grid of, is this real? Is that really not real? And so, and many times that can help us to not get into these storms that we find no way out of. Or maybe we're like Paul and we're part of a situation who, it was because of bad decisions of the crew or our family or other people that I'm in the midst of this storm. And so it's not my fault, but what do I do? And usually what we do in those situations is say just that. It's not my fault. I don't deserve this. Why is God letting this happen to me? But see, there's a clear teaching here that Paul knew that it wasn't his fault, but he became the solid rock in the midst of that storm. And it was not his storm. It was not his fault. But he was going through that storm and he was bringing hope and insight to other people, but it had nothing to do with him. It's almost like somebody else's sin is affecting our life. And so how do we deal with that? And I think that we deal with it the same way he did. What is our anchor? What is our hope? What are we going to hold on to in the middle of this crisis of life that we're going through? And so then everything that this person of wisdom, Paul, had said to them came true, and it all came to be. And so, the story goes on after that. And you can go on and read from yourself, but a lot of different things happened, and Paul went on. He went to prison, but he wrote a lot of these other books. But see, he never lost sight of who his hope was in, who his identity was in, what he believed in, and he stood strong in no matter any of those things. And so, see, that is so hard for us as people who are in the healing and recovery process, because we've never really had a foundation that we've held on to. And a lot of things that we've held on to have been jerked away from us. But see, the whole idea that Jesus tried to teach people before he was crucified and left earth was that I'm not going to do that. And you remember I say all the time, he promised the disciples, I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit and he's going to teach you. And see, I believe that this is an example where Paul was getting that insight, where the angel was coming and giving him insight. And I believe God still does that to us today, but it's part of our walking it out process with him. And so my challenge is as we go into groups and as we begin to talk about these things, where am I in this story? And not as a downer of, man, I should have listened, somebody told me, and now I'm in the middle of that. Because that is not a downer. That's a huge step forward in saying, now I see that. What do I do? Go back to this person that had that godly wisdom and say, what do I do next? How do I hold on here? What did God teach you? How am I going to get through this? Will you stick with me through this? Or maybe we were that person, and many times you'll hear people say, well, I get tired of giving people a word of advice that I know is truth because they never listen to me. And so we can be on that end of the spectrum to where we're like, I'm just never saying anything to anybody else anymore. But I would say that you would be surprised at things that we say to people and you think that they don't listen, but someday they hear those words again. And I think that a lot of times those words that people said to me were probably God words, and at the time I didn't realize they were God words. They were just clear, wise, good wisdom, good advice. And they came back to me many years later thinking, I really should have listened to that. And so those things that we may at times want to hold back from saying, don't do that. Be cautious. There's a storm ahead if you go down that road. That we need to be encouraged to go ahead and say those things to the people we're around. And these were people that, Paul didn't necessarily know all of them, even though they knew him. But he was going ahead and speaking his mind and speaking what he thought was truth to those people around him. And so I challenge you as you go into group to talk about these and get encouragement no matter where you're at in this process. And trust that as we're on this journey with God, that he will continue to teach us new things, and he will make us that person of wisdom. He will make us this person that's turned around, or we'll have a story of hope that we're going to be sharing with somebody else. God, we thank you so much for loving us, and we thank you that for these stories where we can be encouraged and from real things that happen and people hanging on to you, the God that we know and trust. And I just pray, God, that all of us here can know that you will be there for us in no matter what situation, even though our feelings may not line up with that. And help us, Lord, to reach out to all those that you may have put in place to give us wisdom and encouragement, to bring us back into focus to who you really are and how you want to care for us and protect us and take care of us, and how that you can teach us to be peaceful in the midst of the most ferocious times of life, like these men were those 14 days or so. And so, God, we love you, and we honor you, and we praise you, and we thank you so much for Jesus. Amen.